The Senate Committee on the Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution hearing today will come to order, and I thank all of our witnesses for being here. Ranking Member Cruz coming straight for the vote. I apologize for the delay, but we had a vote, and I thank also the witnesses who are participating remotely today. Before we begin the hearing, let me just take a moment to recognize that today is the one-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, the recent guilty verdict. A lot of events that have occurred in this past year provide necessary accountability, but it isn't true accountability, and it isn't true justice. Justice would be for George Floyd to be here, alive, today. True justice, equality, and equity require real action and real change in policing and all across our society, elimination of racism, wherever it exists. There's a lot of work to do. The Subcommittee on the Constitution will have a part in it, so will our entire Senate, and we need to move forward with action to match this moment of reckoning for our country. We're here this afternoon for our third hearing on another critical issue facing our country involved in stopping the epidemic of gun violence that claims more than 100 lives every day in the United States of America. In our first two hearings, we covered red flag laws and ghost guns, and now we're turning to safe storage. Ethan's Law, which I introduced in this Congress, would be a vital step forward toward stopping unintentional shootings that occur every day in this country. In fact, nearly every day there is an unintentional shooting by a child. Last month in Texas, in Houston, a 3-year-old accidentally shot and killed his 8-month-old brother. Last January, police in Murray, Utah, reported that a 3-year-old was accidentally shot in the head when he woke up before his parents, climbed onto a counter, and started playing with a gun. In both of these cases, the gun was unsecured. In the worst of these kinds of tragedies, someone loses a life. In many, the shooter, a child, has to live the rest of their life knowing they killed someone, frequently a close family member. Those shootings tear apart families every day in America. In addition to the unintentional shootings, there are the suicides, 700 of them every day, involving children dying by gun suicide, often using guns belonging to a family member, 700 every year. The risk of youth suicide is far greater when a gun is accessible. In fact, one study found that the best indicator of a state's youth suicide rate is, quote, household gun ownership. And we will hear more about that issue from our witnesses today. Securing firearms also will reduce firearm shooting in our schools. Roughly 75% of incidents of gunfire on school grounds involve a shooter who has obtained a weapon at a home, in the home of a friend or relative, and we know about that phenomenon in Connecticut all too well from the Sandy Hook massacre. Safe storage laws save lives. It's that simple. Safe storage laws are needed to protect our nation's children. 8 children every day are unintentionally injured or killed due to an unsecured gun in the home. Let me repeat that. 8 children every day in the greatest country in the history of the world are killed unintentionally or injured by a gun unsafely stored in a home. 40% of households with guns are unsafely stored. Nearly 1/4 of parents whose children admitted handling guns didn't know their kids had done so. And the stark fact is there's no way to undo the damage, the death and tragedies that result once a gun is fired, whether it's unsafely stored in a gun in the first place. Today, we'll hear from Kristin Song about the enduring and permanent pain and loss an unsecured firearm can cause. She's joined by her husband, Mike, and her story of her loss of their 15-year-old son, Ethan, to an accidental shooting with an unsecured gun, I think will move the nation. In 2019, heeding their heartfelt call to action, Connecticut enacted Ethan's Law with bipartisan support to require that gun owners safely and securely store their firearms. To Kristin and Mike, I just want to say we are not done. We will not be done until we pass Ethan's Law in the United States Congress. And your being here today means the world. We're going to do everything we can to pass Ethan's Law, and I ask my colleagues across the aisle, as well as on our side, to help us do it. Of particular interest, I hope, to my colleagues are the 33 states, including Texas, that have already adopted some form of safe storage access law. It's on the books in those states. It varies from state to state, but what we need is a national standard now, and there is a reason that those states have passed those laws, because they work. They work to prevent deaths and injury. Quote, unloaded firearms can be secured with a firearm locking device to make them safe, inoperable. Unloaded firearms also can be stored in a locked cabinet, safe, firearm vault, or storage case. That's a quote from the National Shooting Sports Foundation, Instruction to Gun Owners. Thank you, Mr. Bertozzi, for being here today and for the program that NSSF sponsors. Quote, that strong boxes and security cases are inexpensive and give quick access to firearms in a defensive situation, end quote. And, quote, gun safes are the most secure storage option, end quote. That is from the NRA in August of 2020 in an article entitled 5 Tips to Safely Store Your Gun. There is no question that guns should be safely stored. On all sides of this issue, there's a consensus. The disagreement is only whether there should be a law requiring it. My colleagues, the groups on all sides, agree that it should be done. The opponents just don't want anyone to tell them to do it. They agree that gun owners responsibly should keep their guns safely stored. They just don't want a mandate. But we know this issue is one of public safety, where we always, when it's a matter of life and death, accept legal requirements. Airbags, seatbelts. Everybody agrees. A matter of public safety, and that's why we require them. Keeping prescription drugs out of the hands of children. We agree that it should be done, and we have laws requiring child-proof containers. Some say that safe storage laws are unconstitutional, but they've been upheld across the country. Some say that safe storage will make it impossible to use firearms in self-defense, but modern safes with digital or biometric controls make it as easy to unlock as it is your phone. We can disagree about the details, but the recognition is unanimous, or virtually so, that we must work together to pass a measure at the federal level, unanimous among people who believe in gun safety and stopping gun violence, because these injuries and deaths are preventable. If we choose to act, we must act. And I, again, thank you for being here today. I turn to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to each of the witnesses that are here today. Every responsible gun owner and we expect that everyone with a firearm in their home should do the same. We also know that when firearms are not stored responsibly, there can be tragic consequences. Senator Blumenthal spoke about Ethan Song, a 15-year-old boy who fatally shot himself by accident with a firearm that was stored at a friend's house. For all of us, our hearts goes out to the entire family. And Ms. Song, thank you for being here. Thank you for telling your son's story. As a parent, what you experienced is a nightmare that terrifies every parent. All of us want to avoid tragedies like that happening in the future. At the same time, firearms in the home can be critical for defending the home, can be critical for defending members of the family from violent crime. One example of that we will hear from today occurred on November 5th, 2017, when a vicious murderer walked into the sanctuary at Sutherland Springs First Baptist Church in Texas and started shooting innocent churchgoers. Stephen Williford, who I've since gotten to know quite well and who will be a witness today. Mr. Williford was a neighbor just down the street, and he heard the shots. And he went and got his weapon, which is an AR-15, and he ran down the street and engaged with the shooter. And his heroism saved lives that day. His heroism was extraordinary. I can tell you, I was in that sanctuary the day after that shooting, and it remains one of the most horrific things I have ever seen, to stand in that beautiful church where a deranged madman committed an act of unspeakable evil. Mr. Williford's weapon was secured in a gun safe, and the time it took for him to remove it from the gun safe slowed down his response time. And one of the challenges that we all face is a slowed down response time in an instance like that can mean the difference between people living and people dying. All across the country, people rely on quick access to firearms in their homes to defend themselves. A 2013 report ordered by the Obama administration's CDC stated that, quote, almost all national survey estimates indicate that defensive gun uses by victims are at least as common as offensive uses by criminals, with estimates of annual uses ranging from 500,000 to more than 3 million. We're not talking about one or two or a handful. This is the Obama administration estimating defensive uses of firearms, in other words, firearms used to prevent a crime, occur somewhere between 500,000 and 3 million times a year. If our objective is to save lives, and I believe all of us want to save lives, ensuring that people can effectively access their firearms to defend themselves and their families is critically important. And sometimes the defensive use includes children defending themselves and defending their families. For example, earlier this year, a 12-year-old boy in Goldsboro, North Carolina, shot two masked intruders, killing one of them after they forcefully entered his home and shot the boy's grandmother. In 2018, a 15-year-old girl who was also from North Carolina and who had been trained on how to shoot and safely handle firearms, grabbed a gun hidden in her house for protection and shot her mother's abusive boyfriend after he had attacked her mother and threatened to kill her. If the firearms that these minors had used to defend themselves and their families had been inaccessible, the consequences could very well have been devastating. So when we talk about safe storage, we have to keep in mind that restricting quick and ready access to a firearm potentially comes at a serious cost to people's lives. We should be encouraging people to make responsible choices that balance the risk of accidents with the need for self-defense. And that's exactly what many of the voluntary programs across the country have been doing. For example, Project Child Safe, run by the National Shooting Sports Foundation, provides gun locks free of charge. And I will tell you, this is an issue on which there can be bipartisan cooperation. When it comes to Project Child Safe, it so happens that I have a very personal history with that project, because in the years 1999 and 2000, I was a policy staffer working on the George W. Bush presidential campaign. And as a policy staffer responsible for domestic policy, I was the 28, 29-year-old staffer who designed the very first Project Child Safe and drafted the briefing paper and presented it to then Governor Bush. And Governor Bush agreed and campaigned for president in 2000 on Project Child Safe, on providing gun locks free of charge to the millions of Americans who don't have gun locks, so that they can better protect themselves, their families, their children, the friends of their children. And that project ended up being announced, campaigned upon, and when George W. Bush was elected, implemented. And today, Mr. Bartozzi works very directly with it, and I have to say it is encouraging now, the millions of child locks that have been given out that came from an idea a 29-year-old kid had sitting in a cubicle that has since been implemented. Critical to that is that it is voluntary, that it is providing child locks so you have the equipment free of charge, so that cost is not a barrier to being able to lock a firearm, but it is not mandatory. And I believe people can and should make a judgment about what the needs of their home, of their neighborhood, of protecting their family are. The bill that Senator Blumenthal has, I think, goes too far in terms of mandating a federal rule for everyone. For example, the bill would prevent a family with teenage children in a crime-ridden neighborhood from choosing to keep a firearm somewhere where it could be quickly and easily accessed for self-defense. And it would empower the federal government to enforce that law coming into the family's home and potentially arresting the parents and seizing the firearms. Not only that, it would make it a federal crime for the children I mentioned earlier, the children who defended their homes and defended their families with a firearm, to have access to the weapons that saved them and their loved ones. I don't think that makes sense. I don't think that's an approach. And by the way, whether or not children have access to firearms, I think varies widely depending upon the age and maturity of the child. It is a different thing for a parent of a 16 or 17-year-old child at home who's trained in how to handle a firearm, making the decision that that child should be able to defend himself or herself in the case of a violent intruder, than it is to allow elementary school kids to play with loaded firearms. And there's a full spectrum that responsible parents should make judgments of when it is appropriate and when it is not appropriate to put a minor in a position to be able to defend himself or herself. All of us want to prevent firearm accidents. It is tragic. It is horrific. I can tell you in our home, our girls are 10 and 13, and our firearms are locked away and they don't have access to them because we're not at a point where we think that is a reasonable judgment to make. But I don't know that there would never be a point where we would make the judgment that it makes sense to give them access to it if needed. I think there's a lot we can do as a voluntary matter. I think there's a lot we can do with education. I think there's a lot we can do encouraging the use of safe storage. I also think we have an overlay of civil liability laws, that if you have individuals that are behaving irresponsibly, they face potentially enormous civil liability. But I don't believe a federal criminal mandate is the right approach to this issue.
Thanks, Senator Cruz. We've been joined by Senator Whitehouse. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to introduce the witnesses, and then I will swear them in, as is the custom on the Judiciary Committee, and then we'll have your testimony. Kristin Song is from Guilford, Connecticut. She became a gun safety activist after her 15-year-old son, Ethan, was killed with an unsecured gun in a neighbor's house. When she learned that the negligent gun owner would not be charged, Ms. Song was determined to strengthen Connecticut's safe storage law. Her approach in the Connecticut State Legislature was instrumental, in fact, decisive, in bringing together lawmakers from both sides of the aisle to find common ground and help keep kids safe. Ms. Song's advocacy was instrumental in passing Ethan's law in Connecticut in 2019. She and her husband, Mike, created the Ethan Miller Song Foundation to honor the causes that were important to Ethan: veterans, animals, standing up for those who are vulnerable or marginalized. Mr. Stephen Wilford is a native of Sutherland Springs, Texas. An avid sportsman, he began shooting at a young age and honed his skills by participating in competition as he grew older. He made sure his 3 children were trained in gun safety, passing along his expertise. Following the deadly mass shooting in Sutherland Springs in November 2017, Mr. Wilford became known as, quote, the good guy with a gun, end quote, having disrupted the shooter. Stephen credits his faith and preparedness as to why he was able to step in during the critical accident to that training. Dr. Maya Haas is a board-certified pediatric emergency medicine physician at Children's Hospital, Colorado, and an assistant professor of pediatrics at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. She's a researcher focused on firearm injury prevention and founded and chairs the Firearm Injury Prevention Collaborative at Children's Hospital in Colorado. Joe Bartozzi is president and CEO of the National Shooting Sports Foundation and the Sporting Arms and Ammunition Manufacturers Institute. He also serves as chairman of the Project Child Safe Foundation. He has spent roughly 40 years in a variety of technical and executive management roles in the manufacturing sector. Dr. Ted Bonar is a clinical psychologist and director of End Family Fire at Brady, and executive director of the Clinical Readiness Project. He's a national recognized trainer and speaker at conferences and universities, and he's known as a subject matter expert in suicide prevention, lethal means safety, military and veteran mental health concerns, and PTSD. I'll ask all the witnesses to please stand and raise your right arm. Do you affirm that the testimony you're about to give today to the committee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Let's begin with Kristin Song.
Good afternoon, Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Cruz, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you so much for inviting me. I once knew a woman. Her eyes sparkled. Her posture was relaxed, her movements deliberate and full of energy. She smiled, laughed, and loved to tell anyone who would listen, seize the day. She lived her life that way. The pleasures in her life were her family, and her greatest joys were her children. Her heart was full of gratitude. Her children grew into teenagers, and she fell more in love with them, even when she received phone calls. Mom, I'm okay, but the car is totaled. Mom, don't freak out, but I broke my nose in 3 places at baseball practice. Or when the school called to inquire if her 3rd child was planning on handing in any homework ever. She understood these were trials and rites of passage. They were surmountable and good learning lessons for her children. I saw that woman on January 31st, 2018. She and her son had a fun and relaxing morning together. He got his braces off, and he was so happy. She took a picture of him with his new smile and sent it off to her husband. They headed off to breakfast to celebrate, and her beautiful boy told her about his hopes and his dreams. He wanted to go to Rice University, join the Army, marry, and have 7 children. They returned home, and her beautiful boy walked to his best friend's house. An hour later, the woman saw 2 police officers walking across her lawn. Her heart sank. She heard the ambulance scream by her street, carrying her beautiful boy. They raced to the hospital, praying that their beautiful boy was still alive. She ran into the hospital and headed towards the bays, where her beautiful boy lay. But she was stopped and guided to a tiny room. The ER doctor slid down the wall, put his head in his hands, and whispered, "Your beautiful boy is gone." She crawled into a fetal position. She just wanted to disappear. Her husband called their daughter and son. She will never forget the raw, guttural sobs that escaped from their mouths. She begged to see him. She needs to tell him again that he is so loved and cherished, to kiss his forehead, to tuck him in one last time. She was the first to welcome him into this world, and she wanted to be the last to say goodbye. The doctor chokes out, "He is unrecognizable, even to her eyes." While her family walks out of the hospital, her beautiful boy is being wheeled to the morgue. The woman and her family sit in silence on the car ride home. There's nothing to say. You can't fix death. I saw that woman on February 1st, 2018. Her eyes are dull, her posture slumped, her movements as if by rote. She's in a stupor. Her smile has turned to tears. Her energy is gone. The pain that she feels is similar to holding your hand over a hot flame, intense, unrelenting pain. She can barely breathe. She doesn't sleep much, and when she does, he calls to her. She frantically tries to reach him, but he slips through her fingers and slowly fades away. She would have traded places with him in an instant. She would have laid down her life to save his. She sits with her coffee in the kitchen and contemplates suicide. No more pain. But her other son grabs her hand and says, "I would not survive if I lost another member of this family." How did he know? Was it so obvious? She now knows she has no other choice but to live. My name is Kristin Song, and I am that woman. The beautiful boy was my 15-year-old son, Ethan. He was shot in the head in his best friend's house with an unsecured gun. He had 0 chance of survival. The father, the gun owner, stored his 3 guns and bullets in a shoebox. What would you do never to be asked these questions by a funeral director? Do you want to bury or cremate your child? Or do you want a lock of their hair? I'm sorry, that is all that I can offer you. To avoid having to answer those questions, would you use a biometric safe that opens in just a few seconds just to secure your guns? I wanted to thank all of the gun owners, especially Senator Cruz, who secures their weapons, because Ethan would have been safe in your house. he would have walked out of your home and into my arms. While I applaud all the organizations that emphasize that it is a gun owner's personal responsibility to secure their guns, that is clearly not enough. If it were, I would not be here today. I would be home with my son, running around looking for his lacrosse uniform that always seemed to be lost, peppering him with questions about his day, and stopping by his bedroom at night to let him know that I love him. We need laws like Ethan's law to mandate safe storage and save lives. The gun owner could have saved Ethan in the time it takes to draw one breath by simply locking up his guns. If he had, my beautiful boy with his infectious smile would be walking across the stage to accept his high school diploma next month. Instead, that night, while his friends are throwing their caps into the air, I will be sitting at Ethan's grave, and the only one speaking his name will be me. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wilford joins us remotely, and I'd like to call on him now.
Hello, my name is Stephen Williford. I'm from Sutherland Springs, Texas. I'm here to tell you about decisions made on November 5th, 2017, and the consequences of those decisions. This is the hardest statement that I will ever make in my life. I have been a gun owner all of my life. I own a safe because I thought it was a responsible thing to do. I kept my rifles, my handguns locked away because nothing bad happens in my town, until it did. On November 5th, 2017, an evil man opened fire into the First Baptist Church, Sutherland Springs, where 49 of my friends were gathered to worship. This man brought a vehicle full of firearms and ammunition that he obtained because the government failed to enforce its own pre-existing laws. When I recognized what I was hearing was gunshots, I flew into action. Imagine yourself running down the hallway to your house and fumbling with a lock on your safe. Imagine hearing each shot ringing through the air, knowing that one of your community members is on the receiving end of each bullet, knowing that you're not fast enough. I grabbed my AR-15. I grabbed a handful of ammunition, 8 rounds. I ran to my front door, loading the gun as I ran. How much time had I taken? I timed it now. It's about 2 minutes. I could have shaved 90 seconds off if my firearm had been loaded and not locked behind a giant steel door. I timed that too. 90 seconds does not sound like a lot, but to me, it will always be the longest 90 seconds in my lifetime and my greatest regret. The police officers in our county are some of the best. They did everything they could to respond to the active shooter. But as Chris Bird wrote, when seconds count, police are only minutes away. It took 19 minutes for the police to make it across the county to our town. After the first 911 call, every second counted. I was my community's first responder. I didn't even pause to put on my shoes. The gunfire continued. I yelled as I drew closer, and the shooter heard me. My voice made him stop killing my neighbors and face me. Seconds before he heard me, he shot Chris Workman in the spine, paralyzing him from the waist down. If I had had my firearm ready, would this young husband and father still be able to walk today? I have never asked who was shot before Chris. I can't bear to know. 49 people went to church that morning. 26 didn't make it out alive. And not one person walked out of the church without an injury. Firearms did not commit this atrocity. Don't get this story wrong. Evil did this. My firearm stopped it in its tracks. but how much faster would I have been able to respond if I had my gun ready? In contrast, let me tell you about April Evans. April Evans is a young mother from Virginia. One night when April was home alone with her 2-year-old daughter, a criminal began busting her door down. April had her gun. She called out, warning him, but he didn't stop. As he burst into her house, April fired, brought him down, and held him at gunpoint until the police arrived. Imagine if April had not had to fumble with a safe. Imagine if politicians had passed a law mandating that April was not allowed to do what she did, had to have it in a locked safe. Would she have had time to protect her daughter and herself? There are a lot of things that we can learn from these stories. First is the importance of the Second Amendment. Second is importance of preparedness. No one thinks that something like this can happen in their communities, but it can. I will always be haunted by those 90 seconds wasted getting my gun from a safe and loading it. I will never again keep my firearms unloaded in a safe. Whether or not this law passes, I will not comply. Won't make that mistake again. It came at too high of a cost. The answer to our problem is not restrictions. It's an informed public. It's an educated kids on gun safety from an early age. Government stepping in to individuals' homes and dictating how they can act in each circumstances, legislating how they are allowed to defend themselves and their families will not end well. We as individuals are responsible for the decisions we make in our own homes. We have that right. Our government is there to protect and support that right, not legislate it. Each of you made a promise when you were sworn into our office. When people ask me how many lives I think I saved that day, my answer is always the same: not nearly enough. I want to thank the United States Senate and this committee for allowing me to speak today.
Thanks, Mr. Wilford. We're going to go to Dr. Haas. Dr. Haas, I think you need to press your microphone button. Thank you.
Sorry, it's better. Thank you, Chairman Blumenthal and members of the subcommittee, for the opportunity to testify here today. My name is Dr. Maya Haas, and I'm here today representing Children's Hospital Colorado and the Colorado chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. I've been a pediatric emergency medicine physician for 10 years now. In that time, I've seen many firearm injuries, including in children as young as 2 years old, which could have been prevented by safe storage requirements. The lucky ones survive with any number of visible scars to carry along with the emotional and psychological trauma that they and their families carry forward. Those who do not survive leave behind a world of grief. The cry of a parent whose toddler died is agonizing in any circumstance. When that child has been fatally shot in a preventable accident, the added layers of guilt and what if add a new, almost tangible layer of pain for all involved. Firearms are the second leading cause of death in children in the United States. On average, more than 17 children are injured by a firearm every single day. On average, more than 32 die every week in the United States. Something has to be done to protect our kids from the dangers of unsecured firearms. I thought about this a few months ago when a 14-year-old came to the emergency department after a suicide attempt by drug overdose. Minutes after his attempt, he felt a moment of remorse and told his parents what had happened. They called an ambulance. They brought him to us. We took care of him, and he survived. This same story happens multiple times a week in my emergency department. After receiving medical and emotional help, suicidal patients get another chance at life, and the vast majority do not go on to die by suicide. But firearms are uniquely lethal. I knew that that 14-year-old boy probably wouldn't be there for us to help had he used a gun. More than 90% of those who attempt suicide with a firearm do not have the chance to change their mind. For adolescents, over 80% of these firearms are found in their home, and most belong to a parent. These are the realities that I see play out in my line of work every day. Over the last year, the COVID-19 pandemic has complicated my job somewhat. I had to learn ever-changing processes and keep pace with new evidence. But COVID also showed us what's possible when research and public awareness are combined to save lives. As the pandemic progressed, we got better at treating patients, and the community stepped up to stop the spread. Now there's less fear and uncertainty, and we are so far ahead of where we were. This needs to happen with gun violence, too. The idea that we could solve these problems in this manner isn't new. In fact, we see it in many industries. Look at the auto industry. When a greater emphasis was put on researching the effectiveness of seatbelts and improving car safety standards, new data-driven safety requirements reduced deaths from motor vehicle collisions for minors by 38% between 2007 and 2016. In that same time, the rate of firearm-related mortality among children and adolescents stayed the same. What's the difference here? When it comes to firearm-related deaths, there is a distinct lack of data-supported public health interventions that is supported by state, local, and federal governments, and particularly as it relates to safe storage. Reducing firearm deaths is not just a public health issue, it's a public health emergency, and we have a duty to ourselves and to our children to act. We have a roadmap. We need to do what we did to decrease deaths from COVID-19 and from motor vehicle collisions. We didn't resort to drastic measures such as removing all the cars from the road. We identified ways to make common sense changes that have a meaningful impact, and the same can be done with firearms. Firearm sales are on the rise, and 4.6 million children in the United States live in homes with at least one loaded and unlocked firearm, putting them at higher risk of shootings. Curious toddlers are at risk. Individuals experiencing crises with access to firearms are in serious danger, as are women and children vulnerable to domestic abuse. For them, home can't be a refuge until we act. Federal law doesn't require gun owners to securely store their firearms when children are present in the home. 29 states, or now it's 33, and the District of Columbia have some form of law to do so, and many have seen suicide and unintentional gun deaths and injuries among minors drop by up to 54%. Because of my experiences, I testified in March before the Colorado State Legislature to support such a law, which was thankfully enacted. I urge the members of this subcommittee to consider and act upon similar legislation at the national level, including Chairman Blumenthal's bill, Ethan's Law, which would set a national standard for the storage of firearms in residences where children live, and Chairman Blumenthal's Safe Gun Storage Act, which would establish consumer product safety standards for firearm locks and firearm safes. I'm here for the 5-year-old boy who's paralyzed from the waist down by a stray bullet that struck him while he was just playing outside, and now has to come to the emergency department every time he has a fever. I'm here for the toddler who came to our hospital, shot while playing with her sibling, for her family who will agonize over her death and whether they could have prevented it. I'm here for the youth who in their moment of crisis found a gun to use in their suicide attempt. They usually don't make it to our hospital. I wish I could share their names or their stories or more of their faces so you could understand that these could be your neighbors, your grandchildren, your children that I'm trying to protect. I know that the vast majority of gun owners keep their firearms safely away from children and adolescents. However, too many do not. And keeping children safe from firearms should not be a personal choice. I implore you to pass legislation that will ensure that firearms are properly locked so that children do not have access to them. No more broken families, no more needless injuries and deaths. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Cruz, members of the subcommittee. My name is Joe Bartozzi. I'm the President and CEO of the National Shooting Sports Foundation. I'm very proud to be here today to speak on this important topic. First of all, let me start by saying that no family should have to suffer the loss of a loved one in such a preventable tragedy as this. And we really feel bad, especially being from Connecticut. I'm well aware of the situation with the Song family, and it's a terrible thing that nobody should have to endure. But I will tell you this, that it is my personal commitment and the commitment of our industry to educate and spread the word about safe storage, while at the same time respecting the right to keep and bear arms and appreciating and acknowledging that every circumstance surrounding the ownership and storage of firearms is unique. So to be clear on our position, we support the safe storage of firearms when they're not being used. In fact, we are outspoken advocates for safe storage, and we spend considerable time and energy creating the most comprehensive safe storage program in the world, which is Project ChildSafe, as was mentioned earlier. However, we do oppose a federal mandate which would alienate gun owners, infringe upon state efforts in this area, impair the ability of armed self-defense, and create a new, vague, virtually unenforceable federal law, replete with legal implications and penalties. Now, again, I will reiterate that we are terribly saddened by the fact that the firearm that Ethan found was not secured. Okay, but I can tell you this is exactly why Project ChildSafe was created in the first place. It specifically addresses the issue of accidents, misuse, and suicide by identifying several storage options to fit a wide variety of lifestyles. And I will say this on a personal note, that we can take some solace that no organization has done more in this area than has Project ChildSafe, and 40 million Americans are safer today because Project ChildSafe. And just for those that may not be aware, I'll just touch on a few key points. Since 1999, Project ChildSafe has given away more than 40 million locks and safety kits. We've partnered with more than 15,000 law enforcement and community partners in all 50 states and U.S. territories to spread the message of safe firearm storage. That doesn't include the millions that come to our website to download our pledges, our materials, and view our videos to enhance safe storage in the home. And in fact, in the past 20 years, fatal accidents involving a firearm have declined by 40%. And the entire industry is behind this effort, and they're all part of making this thing possible. As an outgrowth of Project ChildSafe, we are now actively involved in suicide prevention space, partnering with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, as well as the Department of Veteran Affairs, to bring suicide prevention messaging and safe storage to everyone, everywhere. And we have now documents and handouts in all states at firearm retailers and ranges to prevent suicides from firearms. I just want to touch on one anecdote here to talk about is that in 2013, then Vice President Biden came to Connecticut post the Sandy Hook murders, and he took aside the then chairman of Project ChildSafe, and he said, referring to Project ChildSafe, "You guys are doing a lot of good things, including the gun lock thing. And this isn't just Joe Biden blowing smoke, I mean it." So even then, Vice President Biden recognized the importance of Project ChildSafe and the value of education in the area of safe storage. I want to touch on one other point that I think is very important to make here, and that is the messenger matters in regards to dealing with firearms issues. We understand that this proposed law, as it's written, will create and could create additional mistrust and animosity between the federal government and gun owners. And my concern here is that gun owners might tune out or not listen to the message if it's coming from an authority, a mandate from the federal government. So we're concerned about that, and we know from our experience with the VA and the AFSP that the audience is more likely to respond to a message if the messenger has credibility, experience, and has earned trust of the audience. Being that we're the trade association for the firearms industry, it's clear that we have credibility in the regard to firearms and how to safely store them and handle them. People look to us for this information, and that, I think, is a very powerful message. So we believe as between training and education versus federal mandates, education and training is more impactful. In fact, the General Accountability Office reported in 2017 that and this is a quote, "Our review of the studies relating to safe storage approaches, that is device distribution and physician consultation, found that providing a free locking device to study participants influenced behavior to store firearms more safely, and physician consultation generally did not." Okay, they said Project ChildSafe is the largest and longest running program of this kind in the country, distributing now over 40 million kits with cable-style locks. So the GAO recognized that there is credibility in what we're saying, and they support the approaches we're taking. I'll leave you with one last point, and that is potential alternative approaches to a federal mandate. As Senator Cruz indicated, Project ChildSafe has been the recipient of 2 federal grants over the years, one during the George W. Bush administration and one in the Obama-Biden administration. Now, these were competitive grants which Project ChildSafe was fortunate to win, and as a result, we're able to spread the word of safe gun storage to millions of Americans. So possibly the government should talk about creating additional grant opportunities so that we can, again, magnify the reach and scope of this project. Right now it's supported by donations, mainly from the industry, from individuals, some companies, but to have the federal money to be able to make this on a larger scale, I think will make a lot of difference for this. The other thing I would recommend is that in 2013, the NSSF supported creating a tax deduction for locking devices. This was H.R. 1883, introduced by Representative John Carter. It would have created a tax deduction for up to $1,200 for the purchase of a locking device. Now, I know a similar bill was introduced last year by Representative Mike Levin of California, but the numbers were very small in terms of the rebates available. So we would certainly believe that there's different approaches to to deal with this problem, and perhaps in a more unifying manner than a federal mandate. So we would definitely welcome new voice to the discussion, and thank you again for your time and attention. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mr. Bartozzi. Mr. Bonar.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Cruz, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Dr. Ted Bonar, and I'm here today to speak to the importance of safe storage of firearms. I'm a clinical psychologist from Columbus, Ohio, with a specialty in the treatment of suicide, post-traumatic stress disorder, and working with service members, veterans, and their families. I've worked directly with the military-connected community throughout my professional career. I trained at the Jesse Brown VA Medical Center in Chicago. I've held clinical positions as a veteran expert at 3 universities. I've worked as a subject matter expert with PsychArmor and the Center for Deployment Psychology. I'm now the director of End Family Fire with Brady. Family fire is a shooting involving an improperly stored or misused gun found in the home, resulting in death or injury. End Family Fire is a national educational campaign that speaks directly to and with gun owners to increase the safe storage practices of firearms. 23,000. It's an astonishing, devastating number. That is roughly the number of people living in America who will die by suicide using firearms this year. Suicide is complex, and there is one variable that stands above all others as a determining factor. That variable is access to a firearm, because when a firearm is used in a suicide attempt, the result is death about 90% of the time. But simply, we can effectively reduce the number of suicides in the United States through strategies that increase the safe storage of firearms. I'd like to make 4 important points about suicide and firearms. First, there's a common belief that the majority of people who die by suicide take action impulsively. However, most people who attempt suicide have thought about the plan and action well ahead of time. The moment of decision comes after experiencing incredible psychological pain and the deep desire to be free of that pain. The word impulse implies that there is nothing we can do about any of this, and this is false. Second, firearms are the method of suicide that results in death far more than any other. Other methods of suicide attempts are much more frequent, such as the most common method of intentional drug overdose, which results in death about 2% of the time. No other common method of suicide comes close to resulting in death 90% of the time. Third, when a person is at risk for suicide, an evidence-based strategy is to put as much time and distance between a person and the method as we possibly can. Safe storage practices, sometimes increased during a crisis, provide a temporary barrier between a person in crisis and a firearm. There are countless methods of safe storage of firearms that respect the rights of firearm owners while decreasing the likelihood that the firearm might be used in a suicide attempt. And fourth, there is a belief that if someone wants to die, they will end their life through any method possible. So if they don't have a firearm, they will simply reach for something else. But means for suicide are rarely substituted. The method a person chooses to attempt suicide is a personal decision, and for gun owners or someone from law enforcement or a military-connected background, the lethality of guns is not an abstract concept. If a firearm is chosen, it is not easily substituted. We must also address the problem of suicide in the context of veterans and veteran households, as veterans use firearms in suicide attempts and die by suicide at a much higher rate than civilians. They also have much higher rates of gun ownership. I'll quickly share viewpoints from 3 friends of mine. One, a decorated Marine combat veteran, says, "I have to tell my buddy where and how I'm storing my guns. I can't always have them around, but I still own them." A Navy combat veteran mom with 2 teenagers says, I have a biometric lock. Nothing less would do. And an Army veteran mom with a 3-year-old daughter worries that her kid could find the shotgun the family stores in the back of their closet. Safe storage of firearms is an evidence-based strategy to reduce the rates of veteran suicides, as well as youth suicide and unintentional shootings that result in injury or death of children. I've included more information on each of these in my written testimony and would be happy to answer any questions you might have. Safety and security are common ground values for most Americans who own guns and those who work to reduce the likelihood of unintentional injury or death by suicide. Safe storage of firearms in the home is a principal solution to reducing gun violence and respecting constitutional rights. Laws around safe storage have been upheld by the courts, and the research is conclusive. Safe storage saves lives. I am grateful for the opportunity to testify here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Bonar. I'm going to ask Senator Whitehouse to go first with his questions because he has another commitment, and then ask the ranking member to go ahead. I'm going to be here for the duration, so I'll hold my question.
Thanks. I have a question for Dr. Haas. First of all, thank you for being here all the way from Colorado. You heard Mr. Guilford say that he was never again going to keep his firearm unloaded in a safe, that he was always going to have it loaded and available for himself from here on out. If that were the state of firearm safety in homes across America, what do you think the likely outcome of that would be in your emergency rooms?
I think the outcome would be devastating, and quite frankly, I'm not sure that these kids would make it to our emergency rooms. We know from modeling that even a modest increase in safe storage in homes would significantly decrease injury and mortality to youth. We also know that in states that have child access prevention laws and states that have safe storage laws, there has been a significant decrease in injury and mortality among youth. I am sorry, the personal experience he has, I can understand, but if that was the standard, I think that would have devastating consequences for our children.
So if households kept loaded firearms out and not in safes, could you make any general guesstimates as to what the effect of that would be on either gunshot wounds coming into emergency rooms, or, as you say, gunshot wounds that don't come to emergency rooms because the victim is the decedent?
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to make specific estimates as to the number, but I could say that it would be much more significant just seeing how the injuries and mortality decrease when people do store their guns safely. I think that they would increase significantly if they don't.
That would be the necessary corollary proposition, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for coming here. Thank you, Senator Blumenthal, for this hearing, and good luck with your legislation.
Thanks, Senator Whitehouse. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to each of the witnesses for your testimony. Mr. Bartosi, your organization has distributed more than 38 million gun locks free of charge through local law enforcement agencies and over 15,000 communities across the United States. This voluntary program, known as Project Child Safe, has been so successful that even the Obama Justice Department awarded you with a $2.5 million grant to expand the program. Can you explain how this voluntary program works and what the results have been?
Basically, Senator, we have a lock giveaway program. We partner with law enforcement primarily, but also faith-based groups around the country, and they take the locks and they distribute them to their parishioners, to their people in their communities. Recently, we had the Detroit Police Department go door to door and hand out Project Child Safe locks and materials. There was about 2 weeks ago, the Albuquerque had a drive-through Project Child Safe event where a councilwoman there handed out the free locking device. And this is a non-judgmental, no questions asked program. This is not an idea where we're going to check your credentials about gun ownership. We want people to be safe. We want people to have access to the means of safety right away. So that's why these locking devices are so important. They're immediately available to start using right then and there. Additionally, we have a comprehensive website which offers award-winning videos. We have checklists. We have a pledge that goes out to gun owners about securely storing firearms. And one other thing about Detroit, recently 2 Detroit Piston basketball players did a PSA using our pledge as the basis for the PSA, and it was outstanding. Now, myself, I'm a Celtics fan, so I'd love to see other teams get involved with this. But it is really encouraging to see members of various communities get involved and teach about safe storage. Okay, this is not just about a lock, all right? Lock is important, but more important is education and training. And we talk about what households might be more affected, but it depends on how the children are raised in that household, what type of training education they receive on firearms and safe firearm handling. It all goes together as one, is not one thing or the other. I think you need to have both. So again, the idea is that we make it volunteer. We have resources on social media, on multiple websites. We have availability to give away these locks. We've given away now over 40 million. Now the number is up, and we're very proud of that fact. So again, it's about options, right? Not everyone's circumstances are the exact same. What might work in your house might not work in someone else's. So we explain there's biometric, there's digital, there's RFID, there's combination locks, there's key locks, whatever fits your lifestyle and your economic availability as well, because some of these safes are very expensive. So we want to give people the means to do this right away, to be safe right away, and encourage the use of these locks, but not mandate it.
Mr. Bartozzi, I agreed with your testimony right up until the point when you said you were a Celtics fan. And I have to say, as a Houstonian and a diehard Rockets fan, given the miserable season we had last season, I just found that deeply hurtful. Although I will readily concede Larry Bird is one of the greatest players to have ever played. What did the data show about the effectiveness of Project Child Safe? If the objective is to expand the use of safe storage, does the program work? What do we know?
We know the program works in that, and I won't provide exact, I don't have the exact detail, but in the 22 years that Project Child Safe has been in existence, we know that fatal accidents have decreased by 40%. Okay, now, there's a lot that goes into that. Hunter safety classes, our own First Shots program, which we teach safety to first-time gun owners, things of that nature all come into this. But we also see that fatal accidents involving firearms at the lowest point on record since 1903. We now see that fatal firearm accidents are at less than 500 per year. Now that, again, I will concede is 500 too many. I will not make that argument. However, we are seeing progress. We are seeing progress, and progress is a good thing because it shows that we can have an impact, all right? And that's what we're looking for, is opportunity to have an impact on the discussion, on the dialogue, and the ability to save lives. And that's what we're very encouraged by. Well,
and I'll note one study that researchers did found that the free installation of gun cabinets to 255 households resulted in the rate of homes containing unlocked guns dropping from 95% in the case of this study to 35% within the course of the year. So if the objective is to actually have guns secured where they can't be misused by a child, there are proven results. Mr. Williford, I want to turn to you. You and I have gotten to know each other quite well since the horrific mass murder at Sutherland Springs. I spoke with you the day after that murder, and I would note Mr. Williford was at home minding his own business when the shooting started, and as he described, he ran and got his gun, and he ran down the street barefoot, didn't put on his shoes, and he engaged with this mass murderer. He yelled out at him. The mass murderer fired at him repeatedly. He fired back. Mr. Williford is an NRA rifle instructor. And even though the mass murderer was wearing body armor, Mr. Williford struck him twice, which caused him to flee and stop murdering. In the case of this murderer, he murdered children, including infants. And Mr. Williford then pursued the mass murderer in a truck driven by a passerby and directed the police to where he was, and ultimately the mass murderer passed away from the injuries sustained in that gunfire. The heroism Mr. Williford demonstrated that day was extraordinary, and Mr. Williford, I will never forget what you said that day when I told you that state law enforcement and federal law enforcement repeatedly said if you had not acted and not acted so quickly, that many, many more lives would have been lost that day. And I thanked you for your incredible courage. And your response, you said, you disagreed with the word courage, and you said that you had never been more afraid in your entire life. And at the time I said, Mr. Williford, courage is not the absence of fear, it is acting in the face of fear. Thank you for the courage you had saving those lives. But having gone through that horrific Sunday morning, do you believe if you'd been able to access your firearm more readily, and I would note you are trained, you're safe, you're a grown man, if you'd been able to access it more readily, do you believe that more people would be alive today?
Thank you, Senator Cruz, for asking me that question, because I truly believe there were 90 seconds. We timed it both ways, and it was 90 seconds. And I need people to understand that I'm not advocating that no one keep their guns locked away. I think that the circumstances, your own personal circumstances, will change the situations. My circumstances are, I don't have any young children in my house. And when I do, they are away from the children and taken care of where they cannot get to them. And again, as I stated, that if I would have been there 15 seconds earlier, Chris Workman would still be walking and carrying his 7-year-old daughter. And I don't even want to know who was shot before Chris, because in a minute and a half, that's an eternity. Who else could I have saved on that day? And that will forever haunt me.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Senator Cruz, and thank you all again for being here. Let me begin by joining the ranking member in thanking Mr. Williford for the acts of heroism on that day in Sutherland Springs, and gratitude and admiration for his courage. And I agree with Senator Cruz that it was courage. But just to make the point to him that far fewer than 90 seconds would be required to use the kind of safe storage that is available now. On May 25th, 2021, we have technology, and it's on all of our cell phones, that enable us to press in less than a second, or if we don't like that, in, again, less than a second to access our phones.
Senator Blumenthal, I would note you just put out on C-SPAN the code on your iPhone, so you might want to change that now.
My life is an open book, but I recognize that it's happened before. But more to the point, Mr. Williford, I would like to continue this conversation with you, because our legislation applies to people who could, and I'm quoting, I believe, reasonably expect for a child or someone else who should not have access to a firearm to have that access. Let me just repeat. In the home of the neighbor where Ethan Song was playing, that family could and should have reasonably expected a child to have access because they had a child. Mr. Williford has no children. he could be understood to have no reasonable expectation that a child would have access, or another person who should be denied access, like a convicted felon. This law is narrowly framed. It's not a blunderbuss mass mandate overriding individual rights. And Mr. Bartosi has pointed out that there is all kind of technology now that enables quick, ready, easy, costless access to guns for self-defense if they are needed. There's a whole debate about whether a person may do more damage and harm if untrained and unsupervised in a self-defense case. But putting aside that issue, just to allay Mr. Williford's concerns about this law, it's narrowly framed. Technology permits access in far fewer than 90 seconds. And by the way, although many would recommend that guns not be stored loaded, there's nothing in this law that forbids a gun to be stored safely and securely, but loaded, ready to be used in the kind of circumstance that Mr. Williford encountered. Ms. Bartosi, I must admit that I'm left scratching my head about the argument that somehow education and training are incompatible with this law. Maybe you could explain why that's so, when we know from other health and safety laws that in fact education is promoted by people knowing that there is a legal requirement. Seat belts, buckle up, child-proof caps, be careful. There are educational campaigns designed around these laws. And I will tell you, in the state of Connecticut, as you well know, the song crusade for Ethan's Law was hugely educational. It created a massive amount of awareness about this problem. So maybe you can explain your position.
Yeah, thank you, Senator, for the question. Now I may have misspoke here. Of course, education and training is paramount to everything that we do and everything that we stand for. So there's no question there. The concern here, from my part, is that the bill creates what I would call a one-size-fits-all approach to this situation, not acknowledging that there are differences in circumstances from household to household based on experience, education, and, in fact, training. Whether there are children in the house, for example, makes a big difference. And I would, again, I don't want to beat this to death, but I think the penalty clauses in this bill make it somewhat difficult to comply with, in that it's vague and what is reasonable in secure storage. Once a gun is stolen and used in a crime, that becomes the sole proximate cause of the action which the gun owner then is liable for. And I think that is certainly a bridge too far for a lot of people, because even if it's proven that the gun was locked and reasonably secured, you have to go through the facing prosecution, potential jail time, to clear your name of that and try to prove it to a jury of your peers. I mean, I think there are elements here that we certainly agree upon. I mean, there's no question that we support safe and secure storage. We advocate, as more than anybody else on this planet, we advocate for safe storage of firearms. We do. The record shows it very clearly. The concern is creating another federal mandate that would punish gun owners for the acts of a criminal if the gun is stolen. Right? The homeowner is a victim, yet if that gun is used in a crime or a suicide, God forbid, that becomes a sole proximate cause. I think there becomes legal liability there that I'm just not particularly comfortable with. So, yes, I agree with you that education, of course, is paramount. But I think there are elements of this law that I think just go too far to be in my comfort zone.
If you were assured that a legitimate, law-abiding gun owner would not be charged as a aider and abetter in some crime committed by someone who stole his gun, which I consider, as a prosecutor, unlikely to the point of impossible, you would back this legislation?
Well, I can't say that I would back the legislation. Of course, the devil is in the details. I would certainly commit to taking a look at it. just like we do every other piece of legislation that comes up that affects the rights of gun owners and the firearm industry, which we represent. But I would also point out that the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act in Section 5 does in fact require gun locks to be given out with every handgun, and it is a defense if that gun was locked and is stolen and used in a crime. So there are elements that cross over here that perhaps there is some consistency and compatibility. So I will commit to reviewing any proposed changes to this, absolutely, and have my office and my staff work with your office as appropriate to review this.
Well, let me say, the NSSF tells gun owners, quote, always make absolutely sure that firearms in your home are securely stored out of the reach of children and other unauthorized persons. And it also advised them unloaded firearms can be secured with a firearm locking device to make them inoperable. Stored in a locked cabinet, safe, firearm vault, or storage case. You recognize that quote, I'm sure.
Generally speaking, yes.
I think it would be an understatement to say that we may not agree on all the details, but it sounds like in practice, in effect, NSSF supports safe storage as a practice, but not as a requirement.
That is correct.
That's why NSSF opposes Ethan's law at a federal level. In your written testimony, however, you wrote, and I'm quoting, "It is our belief that individual states and not the federal government are in the best position to make the determination of what it is best for its citizens," end quote.
Yes.
That's correct.
That is correct. And I believe that because, again, every situation is different. Some rural states where hunting is more prominent and prevalent, they teach their children different ways than perhaps people in a more urban setting. So I think the state legislatures are in a much better position to know the individual needs of their constituents than is the federal government. So that's all. The point there is the states ought to have a say in this thing rather than a federal government one-size-fits-all mandate from Washington, D.C. That was the reason why I put that in there.
Let me ask you, Ms. Song, did NSSF support the Connecticut state law, Ethan's law?
Yes. One of the things that my husband and I did was we met with the CCDL. They were the first people that we spoke with about the law and about safe storage. And I want to tell you that they sat down with us and they were really proud about how they stored their weapons, because they did have children in their house and they did understand how deadly these weapons were. I also wanted to share with you one of the Republican comments that was made to me when they voted Ethan's law out of committee by Representative Bizzarro. He shared with me that when he was young, his house was broken into, and he would never forget the fear that his family felt. And so he was going to make sure that his 3 daughters were protected from any intruders. But after listening to my story and hearing Ethan's story, he decided to go out and buy a biometric safe, and he places it now on his nightstand. And he told me, we can do both. I can do both. I can protect my family, but I can also protect my children from any internal dangers. It hadn't dawned on him that his children could gain access to his gun. And, he felt like you could do both. You could protect your family at the same time as keeping the guns out of your children's hands.
So there were Republican legislators who supported it.
Yes, there was overwhelming bipartisan support. I want to say maybe 4 days after we talked about Ethan's law, Vinnie Candelora, who is one of the ranking members in Connecticut's Republican House, not only supported it, but helped us champion the law. These were Republicans that had never voted for a gun legislation in their entire life, and I probably bet they will not vote for another one. But they understood that this was not something that the NRA doesn't ask, that the NSS doesn't ask for, that safe storage is, I spent the weekend going through all of the material of the NRA and the NSSF, and there was not one place that I read or watched where it said that you should leave a loaded, unsecured firearm in your home if you have children. So I'm just asking them to do exactly what they so meticulously and so brilliantly explained for each gun owner. We're not going after the responsible gun owners. We're going after the negligent gun owners, as in my case. Ethan's best friend grew up with guns. He was trained by the NRA on guns. His father took him to the shooting range. His father carried a gun for work. This was not a child who was unfamiliar with how to safely handle a firearm. And yet he went into his father's closet, pulled out the shoebox with the 3 guns and bullets, and introduced my son to what would be his ultimate death.
Ms. Bartozzi, does the NSSF support Ethan's law in Connecticut?
Senator, I don't recall if we actually came out affirmatively to support it. I don't believe we opposed it, recalling that Connecticut already had a safe storage law already on the books. And I would just add one other thing here. You know, what we're talking about from NSS perspective is a proactive approach to educating people. Many of these laws would only come into effect after the tragedy has occurred. We're trying to prevent these things, right? It's more important to prevent a tragedy than to deal with the pieces afterwards, because what prosecutor is going to prosecute a family of a child who was killed by one of their guns? It would be very difficult to do so. So we're trying to get ahead of this thing. We're trying to be ahead of the curve, educate people on what we believe to be the best practice here for keeping guns safely, but also recognizing there are different circumstances from household to household and from state to state. So again, we're looking at it from perhaps a different perspective. There's a lot of common ground here, but there are issues where we would not be comfortable.
But NSSF never supported Ethan's law, and it doesn't today.
I can't say that. I don't know as I sit here today. I don't know.
You represent that organization.
Indeed, I do.
You speak for it today.
Will
you support Ethan's law today?
Are you asking if the organization affirmatively supported it when it was in legislation? I don't know. I don't know the answer. I simply don't know as I sit here today.
You don't know whether the organization supported Ethan's law? My recollection is that you didn't. In fact, that you made statements opposing it.
I think he may be confused between your federal.
No, I'm talking about Connecticut. In
Connecticut, okay, the law in Connecticut we believed went too far in some instances. Obviously, we support safe storage. That is the reason I'm here. That is the sum and substance of my testimony.
I'm asking you about Ethan's law in Connecticut, which you opposed, correct? Now, you thought it went too far. I welcome your being willing to talk to us here at the federal level about the specifics, as you've just indicated. But I think it's important to recognize that even at the state level, despite your testimony here today, you opposed it then. Have you supported safe storage laws in any state?
We do oppose mandates for safe storage. We do support education and training. We support safe storage of firearms. Where we get concerned is the government mandates and the penalties imposed on gun owners. So the short answer is no, but we do believe there's common ground here, which is why we advocate for safe storage in the first place.
Well, the common ground is the same common ground we would have on seatbelts, where we agree seatbelts are important and necessary, and by the same logic, you would oppose a mandate for seatbelts. You'd oppose other public health and safety measures. And so my understanding is that NSSF has never supported, indeed universally opposed, these kinds of laws elsewhere. I'd like to ask Dr. Haas, because you've experienced this problem in a way that I think is difficult for us to comprehend. You've seen the ghastly, gruesome results that the paramedics wouldn't even show Kristin Song. Could you tell us whether you think that these kinds of laws can be preventative of these kinds of tragedies? Mr. Bartozzi has indicated again somehow they're incompatible or they would diminish the effects of preventative action. If you could turn on your microphone again.
Sorry, I could share my experiences both as an ER physician, which I've spoken about some, and also as a researcher, because there is data to support safe storage laws. Education, I agree, is critically important when it comes to safe storage, and much of my research is focused on providing this education in the emergency department to kids who are at risk for suicide, to families who own firearms who have toddlers in the house. However, I don't think education is enough. Education has to be coupled with mandates. Our kids who are getting hurt, who are getting injured, don't get to vote. So it's our responsibility to keep them safe. We know that multiple states have child access prevention laws that go to different extremes, and we know that the stronger child access prevention laws have seen steeper declines in their rates of injury and death for children. So I actually do think that creating a policy is preventive. Creating laws isn't so that we could punish people. Creating laws is so that we could educate people about these laws and they follow them. Creating laws about car seats wasn't so that we could punish people who don't put their kids in car seats. It's so that universally now people put their children in car seats and children are not dying in car accidents. And so I think this safe storage law is very similar and provides the impetus for people to follow the laws, provides the impetus for us to educate families about safe storage and really increase safe storage and take care of our kids.
Thank you. Let me ask Dr. Bonar, do you agree that requiring safe storage would be preventative both in education and in encouraging people to adopt the kinds of new technology that is available?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Blumenthal. I do believe that public education and public health efforts that lead towards behavior change are what we need to move forward to prevent unintentional injury and the loss of life. And I think that the examples that we just heard, whether it's car seats or seat belts, and we have many others that we can talk about, are examples of this. And I think that those are efforts that honor constitutional rights as well as serve as broad public education that result in behavior change that saves lives.
Thank you. I just have a few more questions, but I appreciate all of your patience and the ranking members as well. Kristin, the ranking member mentioned legislation that would provide for tax deductions and grants. Is that enough?
No, but we don't oppose that. In fact, when we chatted with the CCDL, they said, hey, listen, we want an educational program, part of Ethan's law. And we said, absolutely, 100%. Anything that will create a cultural shift so that people naturally, instinctively lock up their guns when children are around. We in Connecticut, I will say that one of the things that I thought was so amazing is that we really put our partisan parties aside, we put our egos aside, and we spoke to each other as parents. And as parents, we all agreed that our children's life, our children's safety was paramount. And you cannot even begin to imagine the pain of losing a child. It destroys your world, it destroys who you are, it destroys your family, it destroys your community. My son, who is a senior at BC, asked me the other day, as we were sitting on the couch, do you think you'll ever be the old you? We miss the old you. And the answer is no. You're broken. You're forever broken. And there's just no way to fix it. So we are all for anything that brings this cultural shift to this country so that people can own guns, defend their families, but at the same time keep children in their home or children who are visiting safe.
And I will just say from my experience that your remarkable advocacy really brought people together on both sides of the aisle, and it made this issue of safe storage distinctive and separate from other issues relating to gun violence, which is the reason why it had such overwhelming support. And I agree with you also that tax deductions for people who purchase safe storage means and mechanisms, I would support it as part of a safe storage law.
Our foundation actually hands out free of charge biometric safes. So we are absolutely 100% for, if you want your gun, go for it, but you need to be responsible.
And grants for education programs?
Absolutely. You know, we've already started creating a curriculum in Connecticut. We're really excited because I think Connecticut's going to lead the way in educational curriculum for gun safety. Again, you know, we're not opposed to that. We totally agree that education could absolutely impact some children, but at the same time, there are some children like Ethan, like his best friend, who was very educated on gun safety. Teenage boys, teenagers, they are stupid and they engage in risky behavior. And as a parent, if you don't understand that, then you're kind of fooling yourself. And I've not found one person yet who hasn't engaged in some risky behavior during their life, even though they've been told by their parents or been educated that it was not safe or appropriate.
And again, extending the analogy to the seat belts or the airbags or other car safety features, the fact that we require seat belts or airbags in cars doesn't mean we're taking away your cars.
Absolutely
or
not.
your license to drive them.
Absolutely not. And truly, I mean this from the bottom of my heart, we do not want to take anyone's guns away. We would really just want to create a cultural shift like we did with Mothers Against Drunk Driving. When I was in college, I was stopped at a sobriety checkpoint upstate New York. I was not driving, but I remember, because I was shocked, the police officer leaned in and said, who's the most sober in this car? You know, my friend raised her hand and they switched, and she wasn't the most sober in the car. But that was the attitude back then, and it wasn't until we had this, you know, until we realized how many people and how many children we were losing to drunk driving, did we make that cultural shift. And now my children, you know, when I say to them, don't drink and drive, you know, they look at me like I'm crazy. And that's really how Mike and I envisioned this law, is that people would, you know, in 20 years, there would be just this incredible cultural shift with the technology, so you could easily access your guns, so you could protect your family, but at the same time protect, you know, your children internally in your home.
And in fact, many state laws authorize judges to require that there be steering wheel locks with breathalyzer tests for people who have violated laws against drunk driving, so that they can't even operate the motor vehicle.
Correct.
If they have had a drink. So let me just finish by saying to Mr. Bartosi, I'll make a deal with you. And it's really an offer to my Republican colleagues. I'll support, and I do support, the tax deduction and the grants in H.R. 8631 and H.R. 1883 if you will support Ethan's law.
Should I respond to that?
Well, I'm not going to ask you to say no now, because I hope maybe we can, or yes, because I hope you'll think about it. And it is a very serious offer, and it's not meant to put you on the spot, and it's not really meant to you personally. It's really meant to people who are thinking about this issue in good faith and who want to save lives. You have testified, in effect, taking some credit for reducing gun deaths by your distribution of safe storage mechanisms. It is a matter of life and death. And if we can reach a bipartisan consensus here, and I think it's within reach because it makes such common sense, I think we can do a lot of good for a lot of people. 8 children every day unintentionally kill or injure people as a result of an unsecured firearm in a home. Even after all you've done, 40% of all the households that have guns do not practice safe storage. I think we can do better. And I think the gun owners of America, more than 60% believe in safe storage. The vast majority of the American people believe in safe storage. Republicans, by I think it's 70, 80%, believe in safe storage. So I'm hoping that we can do better, and this hearing has provided an important step in that direction. Senator Cruz, if you have any, I really want to thank you all for being here today. You've been excellent. To Mr. Williford and Mr. Bonar, thank you. Thank you to each of the witnesses who was here in person. You've been extraordinary, and we thank you. This record will remain open for 1 week in case anyone wants to submit written questions, and this hearing is closed. Thank you.